I'm King Link, and this week we're talking about Her Story as well as some other FMV games, including Late Shift, The Infectious Madness of Dr. Dekker, and Telling Lies. Longtime fans of the channel may realize I have some fondness for stories in video games and have enjoyed many visual novels basically because of this, including Eliza and the first two Danganronpa. Now, I think stories and narratives are poorly done in the video game industry because they usually rely on how movies and books tell stories without considering the interactive nature of the medium. As a quick note, the videos will be a little bit longer play, just because I don't want to really cut through a bunch of videos since the game's already doing that. Now this week I want to talk about a game that I love, and I think maybe one of the most interesting video game stories of all time, and yes, that is of course a very high bar, but I also think it's worthy of consideration for it. This game is simply titled Her Story, and before people make assumptions on the content, take a look at the screen. Now, Her Story has a simple premise. You're looking at old cold case files focused on when someone was murdered, and due to poor record keeping, you only have the interview footage of the primary subject. And yes, that means the entire game was created with a single actress acting as that interview subject. This actress, Viva Seifert, does an incredible job with the performance and material. I may have mispronounced that name. If I did, I apologize for it, but at least I didn't say she was working on Witcher 3, unlike when she won a VGA award. Her story, though, is told out of order, giving players the ability to find clips by searching the dialogue through a rather outdated system. But with the pieces of the story being out of order, players are forced to pay more attention or repeat different clips to make sure they understand the complex story that Her Story has built, as the player is discovering more of the narrative in each video. This is something that can only be done in a video game. To see a counterexample of this, here's a full-motion video game called Late Shift. And in this, we have a movie playing, and our main character, Mac, gets involved in a high-stake, major heist. The big problem with Late Shift is the interactivity. Late Shift is a movie. At least it's shot like a movie with live actors and has minimal interaction with the player. Late Shift offers branching choices at some points of the movie, with many of these changes only being minor pieces of the story. Though a few do change different scenes, locations, and characters, only a couple are actually long-reaching. Problem is, if you put down the controller or just hit the A button at every choice, you get a similar story. The experience is similar enough to watching a movie, and I don't feel making binary choices on a video is enough interaction for the medium. We get the same experience from Bandersnatch on Netflix, and I don't think most people will consider that a true video game. This is actually something that has annoyed me for a while. Having players make choices can be a good thing in video games, but many choices in video games are false, where players will always get the same content no matter what they do. Or maybe it will increment some unseen and mostly unnecessary counter behind the scenes. I dislike this trend because it's like when a teacher is in class asking a question. If you know the answer or you don't know the answer, the teacher will continue the lesson either way. That's perfectly acceptable for education, but I expect more in my entertainment. And Her Story feels more like a game because actively seeking out and finding new pieces of the story involves the player trying to figure out what words or context clues are most important. This isn't the deepest gameplay, of course, but the act of searching for different clips will keep the player engaged in the story as they listen for different keywords and think about what's actually going on with the narrative. The story itself is a large part of the reason to play Her Story. It's well told, but broken up in such a way that almost every player will end with a different path through the entire story, depending on what keywords were searched and what clips were watched in which order. Using these clips to piece together the rather large narrative, though, is interesting, and there's a lot to this story. There's a clear level of craft necessary for Her Story to function within the system, and it does it with those unique rules and limitations that have been set up. Sam Barlow, the writer and creator, has admitted to using a massive Excel spreadsheet just to figure out the way the narrative would be set up. He said that using the file was so large that he had trouble opening it, and, knowing Excel, I totally believe that. Now you can also see it as you type in keyword after keyword here. Her Story only will show a maximum of 5 results for any search, so avoiding using that same word 5 times would be hugely beneficial, especially if you have to get to later clips. There's a lot of design here that's unseen like that, such as how Her Story layers in bigger and smaller pieces of the story together, ensuring that the players can guess almost every keyword just from listening to the audio and making sure the context of the unheard questions can be understood. All of that has to be done at the same time. When you start to consider the scope and challenge with writing a script that can be seen in any order, you start to realize how impressive Her Story's writing is. And I'm going to give Sam Barlow a lot of credit for delivering on the narrative in a new format, because the way the story is written becomes a major piece of the gameplay. The smaller clips allow Her Story's narrative to be broken up into multiple paths that players can progress through. Almost every clip will bring the player deeper into the mystery here. Now, to show how well this flows, we're going to look at Sam Barlow's follow-up game, Telling Lies. This is another FMV game where the players are searching through a database. In Telling Lies, there are multiple different actors in the game, as well as several background characters. The main character here, though, is David, and he's in almost every scene. Well, okay, truthfully, he's in about half the scenes. Telling Lies takes Her Story's formula and evolves it. Rather than a police interrogation, players are looking at a database that shows multiple calls that David has participated in. The challenge is that David and the other side of the conversations are stored separately, thus he's in only half of them. It's a great concept, and the videos are well executed, and a big reason for this is that many of these calls were acted out as video calls, with both actors making the call and being filmed so the timing of the discussion is right. The writing is also unparalleled, similar to Her Story. I also want to call out that Telling Lies has impressive production qualities. The entire cast here is great, the locations are amazing, many characters move around during the calls rather than just staring at the screen. You also get to experience many of the locations. Logan Marshall Green, who plays David, the main character, is impressive with his performances, and the story is really going to hinge on him. They also got Carrie Bish, who people might know from Halt and Catch Fire. She delivers perhaps the best scene in the entire game during a 7-minute call. The downside, though, of Telling Lies, though, also happens in those 7 minutes, and throughout most of the game. There's over 10 hours of video, which equates to about 5 hours of calls, with every video having a second view from the other person on the call, as mentioned. So if the main character David will call Emma his wife, you can find a clip of David's view and a clip of Emma's view, though you will only hear the audio of the current video. That means when Emma delivers her amazing 7-minute monologue, you also get a video of David mostly nodding and listening for 7 minutes. Logan Marshall Green, though, does a great job reacting as David, and his face has so much emotion. His performances make watching his side of a 7-minute monologue slightly interesting, though only slightly. The problem is, this method happens at almost every call, and a majority of these calls are like 3, 4, usually 7 minutes long, so there's a lot of silence to sit through at times. Let me put it this way, though. Since only one person really will talk at a time on most calls, out of 10 hours of footage, 5 hours are silent. Hopefully that math is clear. I mean, it's not that bad because usually you have a back and forth, but when one character starts to monologue for a minute or two, you get mostly silence on the other side, and it's often. I think there's a missing feature on Telling Lies, though, and the absence of which really hurts the experience. If you could choose 2 clips and play them simultaneously, you'd actually see the properly recorded conversation. Now, someone has actually done this and pieced the entire game together on YouTube, and when watching those videos, I have a new level of respect for how natural these conversations flow, and man, the footage is great. But the thing is, this feature doesn't exist in Telling Lies. Instead, you have to click between 2 clips without a seek bar, which is also rather clunky, or you have to watch one of the scenes in full and then follow it with the other side of the conversation. You know, sitting and scrubbing through videos for dialogue just isn't as good. Now, before someone says this was a design choice, it definitely was. I mean, I'm not going to deny that. When you have one side of a conversation, finding the matched video for the other side is excellent game design and a clever and interesting puzzle that I've never seen before. I find that to be one of the best pieces of Telling Lies. Once you have both clips, though, wouldn't it be better to be rewarded with a simultaneous playback rather than expecting the player to flip between the 2 clips like I'm doing on screen? The conversation would sound and feel more natural if they both were playing at the same time. There's one last thing, though, I want to say about Telling Lies. It's the ending, but before we talk about that, I want to talk about Her Story's ending again. I'm not going to give spoilers here. Her Story is only a couple hours long, and players should play through it and discover the story naturally, but there is a piece of Her Story that elevates the game from merely a solid piece of technology to an impressive story. I'm going to try to talk about this here without spoilers, but if you want none, jump forward to the Infectious Madness of Dr. Dekker section in the seek bar or at the time that is on screen. Thanks for sticking around. Now, Her Story has room for interpretation. There are 2 ways of looking at the story, perhaps more, but most fans will seem to subscribe to one of 2 main theories. Think of the final scene of Inception. There are two rather solid interpretations of that scene, of course. That scene, though, was important because it's the one that stuck with people. That was the scene that people discussed or brought up, and the one scene that helped cement the movie because of the level of discussion surrounding it. Her story's entire narrative is wrapped in this similar series of interpretations. When I finished her story, I felt that one interpretation was obviously the right one. I mean, how could it be anything else? It was the only possible answer. In fact, over the years, I've actually flipped on this decision multiple times back and forth, and each time I've enjoyed the trip because it's an interesting story and so well crafted it's enjoyable to revisit the pieces and see it from a new light. While Sam Barlow claims there is a definitive answer, I actually think he left enough clues for both possible interpretations that maybe there's not a true answer. But by leaving an unsolved puzzle at the core of her story, it keeps bringing my mind back to the game. And in fact, this is my big issue with Telling Lies. There are some solid reveals, but by the time I finished my playthrough of Telling Lies, after seeing approximately 30% of the scenes, I had most of the story, and there was a very clear narrative with limited ambiguity to be had. The story is well crafted, told, and delivered, but as I pushed on to see more clips, there was a limited number of reveals left to find, and I stopped after about the 60% mark. Which actually brings us to one other game, The Infectious Madness of Dr. Dekker. In this game, Dr. Dekker was murdered, and players are in the role of the psychiatrist who has sessions with several of Dr. Dekker's former patients to learn about them and potentially Dr. Dekker. Now, the story does try to tell you not to solve the murder, but of course, you will be expected to by the end of the game. Now, the entire game is set up to be more like a discussion than about guessing clues or checking keywords. Rather than looking for any time a patient said the word hello, instead you're expected to ask questions of them. So you might say, "What can you tell me about Dr. Dekker?" But as you're going to be seeing in my playthrough here, I'm having a little fun with the system. As long as you use only one set of keywords, the game will assume you want to see a specific video. Sadly, that means who drank my bottle of vodka gets the same video as what is a bottle of vodka and have you seen my bottle of vodka that was sitting on my desk. And in fact, maybe none of those are the correct question, but as long as the keyword is bottle of vodka or just vodka, the game will accept that as a correct question. Now, similar to all four games this week, The Infectious Madness of Dr. Dekker lives and dies on performances and writing, and I think the performances in this game are exceptionally well done. The writing as well is excellent, and the subject matter is extremely well handled, at least in terms of the supernatural angles here. The entire game mostly revolves around the idea that Dr. Dekker's patients all think they have some level of superpowers, simple things such as stopping time or repeating the same day. Rather than trying to dissuade his clients of those claims, Dekker appeared to be trying to enhance their powers and see how far they could push them. To say The Infectious Madness of Dr. Dekker has interesting thoughts and scenes is an understatement. There are 6 main characters here, 5 of which are patients, and every patient's story had me focused on them, and I kept playing to find out what was going to happen next. Now, the gameplay is mostly about asking questions and hearing responses, though I would say that not every question is completely obvious. You might have to go from who drank the bottle of vodka to what did you do when you were drunk. But because the questions are so specific, asking what did you do under the influence might not give any answer, and spelling will of course matter. Sometimes you're also expected to ask, then what happened, but it's not always clear what that's referring to at times. There is a hint system, of course, but it's based on time, so when you run out of obvious clues, you'll have to sit and wait a couple minutes per use of that hint system, and it makes hunting for the final questions painful to seek out. Now, it doesn't help that the team who made The Infectious Madness of Dr. Dekker is British, and there are some Britishisms that you're going to have to know, such as the term for lawyer is solicitor. It may confuse some fans and honestly made me appreciate her story a little more because I didn't run into many of the same cultural issues in that game. But there's another issue with The Infectious Madness of Dr. Dekker that should be mentioned. It boasts multiple endings as well as a different killer each playthrough to avoid spoilers. Okay. For a solid story though, I really don't think that's necessary, nor do I think it helps the game, especially when the full story is about 10 hours long. Since most of the videos are the same no matter who's the killer, I don't think it warrants multiple playthroughs, and there isn't even a way to replay a specific chapter. But that's not even the issue I have. No, the issue I have here is how the infectious madness of Dr. Dekker ends after the killer is revealed. You see, the game tries to give a final video for each of the patients that aren't the killer, of course, either positive or negative, to summarize that character's journey. But this is a binary choice to encapsulate a rather large and interesting story. At least that's what I think they're trying to do. There's also the final scene that tries to take away something important rather than adding something. Up to that point, the story is left for the player to try to understand what's going on and consider if his patients are telling the truth or not. The finale, on the other hand, tries to give a definitive answer because there is an answer both positive and negative for each character. It struggles to really capture that same ambiguity that the game has offered so far. It attempts to remove that ambiguity in some piece of closure, and it produces a less interesting result. And the thing is, before the final scenes, I absolutely would have raved about the infectious madness of Dr. Dekker. I love the concepts. I love how it was executed. There are many clever scenes and pieces that started to make me question my recollection of what was going on and what exactly was going on with the patients as well. There are many moments in the game that made me excited, but the finale took away most of that and left me feeling like I had arrived at the end of my journey and should exit through the gift shop instead of finding a place to discuss what I had seen further. In fact, I didn't realize I got one of many endings possible. I just realized I got the ending, and I was underwhelmed by it. Now, the thing is, a good story, such as her story, doesn't have to finish the narrative. It only has to end satisfactorily, and leaving the story open to interpretation was the way to go for both her story and Dr. Dekker. In fact, I think it would have really improved that game. I really made this video so I could talk about how the number of ways her story was able to innovate on how narrative could be delivered, and how they executed on it while other games have failed to make their stories come to life. I originally planned to play through the infectious madness of Dr. Dekker and Telling Lies and talk about great FMVs, but instead what I found just reinforced my opinion on her story that it is currently a one-of-a-kind game. Her story has an amazing ability to give the players a way to interact with itself and make them feel like they're playing something that is uniquely available as a game. It gives players an experience that compels them to continue onwards at every step of the game, and it left the story in a state that I'm always willing to discuss due to her stories challenging the viewer, not with the journey, but with the narrative itself. That's not to say the only good video game story that works is an open-ended clip show. But the thing is, every game seems to want to plot along the same path of under-interactive or barely interactive storytelling. It feels a bit disappointing. The story at the core of any game might be as good or perhaps even better than her story, but the method of delivery is what I really struggle with. It's just uninteresting to get the same experience from YouTube as you get playing a game yourself. And this isn't to say all video game stories are bad. I'm currently playing Thomas Was Alone again. I'll probably talk about that before the end of the year. But the video game industry has been here for about 40 years, and yet it seems to always turn towards the movie industry's way of telling stories when the two mediums are vastly different and it has to be handled differently. And no, by adding some false choices, it really doesn't count as interactivity. I think it's time we stop pretending every video game story is a masterpiece and start recognizing some of the exceptional choices, the ones that actually pull us into the world and make us experience something that no other medium can provide. Hopefully I've shown you why I think her story is one of the best video game stories of all time, and while I've shown some shortcomings in some other titles, I'd actually probably put the infectious madness of Dr. Dekker and Telling Lies relatively high on my list because both of them feel unique, which is something I prefer in my video games. And I know the creators of the infectious madness of Dr. Dekker have the shape-shifting detective. I actually purchased that as I wrote this article. And Sam Barlow has been teasing a new game, so I'm definitely interested in both of those. That's what I have for you this week. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if so, please consider subscribing and ringing that bell. I love making these videos, and all I ask from people is to check out some of my videos and subscribe to support the channel. Perhaps it's your turn this week. Of course, you can always share this video. That's how to be the most awesome. I'm going to pop up two videos here. I did a little review of Late Shift a while ago. It's old, but hopefully it will make my opinions clear on that game. I'm also going to link Death Stranding. Now, admittedly, it's not a perfect game. However, I like the story told by Death Stranding, and my main problem was, yet again, how the narrative is delivered. Not with what was delivered, so you can of course check that video out if you want to hear more about that, and you can even compare it to what I've said this week. Until then, I'm King Link, and thank you for watching.